Welcome to another episode of the Business of Speed podcast. I'm Steve Brighton here with Nick Bratton. Excited to kind of bring more content to the listeners this week, and especially a topic that is exciting for me as I'm in a space recently with a lot of sports tech startups and founders and just sharing these extremely cool ideas around the future of what's going to be possible in our industries, whether it's sport specific or it's a training modality, just ways to build communities. And I know for my experience in the private side, we had a lot of technology come through the door. And there was some of it that was useful, maybe not as useful, difficult to integrate, easy to integrate. And it covers everything under the sun. And I know, Nick, you guys have been involved with this from your experiences in the college side, the MBA side, and the private side. But there's really, it feels like this huge emphasis on tech and how to have a quote unquote like player or athlete management system around that tech to really be able to integrate it in what you're doing. I'd love to hear just a little bit of kind of your experiences with some of the different tech that's just come through your door as we kind of build this topic out. And then we'll get into kind of some of the things that we're seeing that might be interesting that we want to get more involved with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that I've used and seen and worked with tech in many different lights. And so, being part of a hospital provider where we have big pockets and it's important that we are on the cutting edge of things, we would use a lot of different pieces and implements. And this was back in the early 2000s. And so, trying to bring in as much as we could to be able to get that involved in the operation. And then going into the NBA, same thing, where you have companies that are approaching you. You're no longer going out and researching things, but you have companies as far as tech that you could be using, whether it's VBT, speed type implements to be using, and then even companies for data collection. And I think we'll talk about that and its importance here. And then now being in the private sector and running it on our own, really being able to decipher down what is the most important, what brings us good quality content for our athletes to learn and to get better with. What is something, we'll talk about this on the business side, that's marketable that we can use to create another revenue stream, and what's noise. Because I know that in the 8 years that we've had BSP, we've gone through all kinds of pieces, whether it's push bands or rep ones, or for a VBT standpoint, looking at Freelap and Dasher and Browser and all the different items that you can use just from a speed standpoint. And so, not to mention jump mats and force decks, but being able to figure out like what brings us value as coaches, what brings our athletes value, what is the appropriate amount of data that we can use and not get buried by, and at the end of the day, especially in my standpoint now, is it worth the money that we're spending? Because now, and we can talk about this too, and I'd like to hear your perspective. Everybody's moving to subscription models. You can no longer go out and buy an implement and just use it for the next 10 to 15 years. Everybody is wanting this monthly fee, which I completely don't agree with, but this monthly fee, and if something happens, they'll replace it. And so, I think that causes a little more caution and concern when that, I'm going to be paying this $120 a month or $200 a month in perpetuity. I better be getting the most out of these units. So looking at it from different perspectives, working in different areas of the field, I think you really have to evaluate, the importance and the use from a day-to-day standpoint.
Yeah, and it usually falls into a couple different categories, whether it's a tool that you're using for assessment, a tool that you're using for a actual training, measuring regularly. Is it a tool that is allowing you to collect the data and create a chart of tracking your system along the way? And I know that that's where so many of the current models haven't just produced a piece of equipment anymore. It's that everyone has their back end system that goes with it in the hopes of making it really convenient. And I was just talking with a coach the other day, and we were discussing just so many pieces of equipment you like, but it doesn't integrate into any sort of platform well. But then there's only one system at this point that really has a stranglehold on an entire ecosystem, and that's the Vold system right now. Like they were able to
Right.
get a Force deck, they were able to get the Nord boards, they bought out Smart Speed, the Fusion Sport timing system, so they have that integrated into it. They have their own jump mat, so that offers that one stop for everything that you need to have. And then many of the other ones have their own platforms, whether now you're talking about different ways to do force plate training, or is it a timing system that doesn't integrate? Is it a jump testing device that doesn't integrate? However, for a lot of coaches, after you've gone down the rabbit hole of athlete management system and ways to track data through their platforms, you come out saying, I don't actually need all of these numbers. My Excel page might work just as well as it always did. It's just a kind of a pain in the butt of how do I get it on there? Where have you been in that space?
Yeah, I think the other thing too is at what point do you stop relying on your eye as a coach and the feedback that you're receiving? And so, when I think about, the different things that we've used and how we integrate it, are we using it on a daily basis? It's easy for me to integrate things like VBT because, we can put it into the program often and be using it on a daily basis. When you talk about things like, the Vault and everything that they have going on, some of those things are a little bit harder to implement, to want to have lying around. I don't want force plates lying around the weight room when I've got a bunch of middle school boys that are walking around. And so, there are other aspects to that as well that, I try to take into account. But for me, it really comes down to what are we able to use on a daily basis, give us good feedback that we're going to be immediately be able to use in that training session. And that's why I've always been so interested in things like 1080. That's something where, you're getting immediate feedback on, the forces being applied, how that the rate of that acceleration, and you can make adjustments should you want to in a session.
Yeah.
And that's where, I think that when I start to look at data and its purpose in a day-to-day setting, I really pay attention to, okay, what am I going to be able to get as a coach in that session that I'm then going to be able to apply? But again, for you and I, when you were at TC Boost, we have the opportunity to do this with the smaller groups, with the semi-private. If I was back in high school, I don't know that that's something that I would really be chasing after because I don't know how I'm going to use that with 40, 50, 60 lacrosse or football players at a time.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I think that is one of your biggest influences is what your setting is, the type of groups that you're running through. That was always an issue with some of the timing systems was to say, well, how simple is this timing system to set up? How quickly can I set it up? Does it require a Wi-Fi signal? Does it require its own system that has to get booted up? Can that fail? If I want to move these timers around and use them for multiple setups in one workout, how quickly can I do that with it? Those became really, really important versus necessarily the validity of the numbers being the ultimate guide. And the same thing kind of would happen with VBT is we had OG Tendo units when I first came in that were incredibly expensive and complex and also very fragile at the same time. And they took up half of the lifting area was dedicated to that. And so then you say like, well, what device are we going to go with that gives us consistent data that is easy to move around? Because we can't have the best data, but have to take up half of the weight room in order to do it. We have to have something that's maybe in the middle of the road, depending on the sizes. And when we talk about the private side, even groups of 5 or 6, if you start really slowing this process down to get the best data possible, you're missing out on it. And in the end, I wasn't a sports scientist that just wanted to do research studies. I was trying to help athletes perform better in their sport. And that didn't always require that I had absolutely perfect data, but rather a way to kind of measure that we were improving, or a way to give me feedback so I can make an adjustment in a session. And that situation came when we brought in the force decks and we were kind of demoing those, and to say, well, I can perform X amount of jumps on a jump mat and get consistent data, although it might not be completely accurate, quote unquote, compared to doing the force deck and it taking an extra 10 seconds per athlete to do a jump on the force deck. It just, that didn't work out for our model of training. It just ate up too much time. But in a different session, that might be the right effect if you're trying to do like really, really detailed research and assessments. I think that's always the back and forth with that. And that's where, in the end, it ends up with a quality timing system that is consistent, reliable, and adaptable to settings. A way to measure vertical jumping that allows it to be consistent, is easily movable, and allows us to have reliable kind of feedback on that one. And then the same with the VBT. It didn't have to necessarily be the top of the line one, but it worked out well. I mean, in the end, we ended up having GymAwares because we were able to have a relationship with GymAware. And I would say that they are just below a Tendo probably as far as the validity and reliability of it. They're a little bit more expensive, but they were still really easy to use. The push bands we struggled with because they kept missing reps. And it was frustrating to the athlete. It was frustrating for us to like rely on this. And then we had the old Vitrufits way back in the day, but I forget what they originally were called. But the same thing would happen with them. They would miss some reps. It's gotten better since then. But that was the part that was frustrating, is like, man, I can't have missed reps. Like, that's the part that if I'm going to use this, I can't have missed reps. It's okay if it's not the perfect data, but missed reps is what becomes really frustrating as we're trying to track stuff.
Yeah. So what would you say is a piece of technology that helped influence you the most in a training session?
Yeah.
Influence how you were coaching, how you were cueing, how you were giving that feedback.
It's the simplest thing was just timing, like having timing system that I could use, not just as every 4 to 8 weeks, we set up the timers and we run 40s, but rather we integrate a system that allows us to track sprints all throughout our training. Within the day, within the week, we're capturing data. And that was the first thing that really influenced, this is what really matters, is getting these times improved, or making sure we're running at a % of our max speed that's going to elicit the response we want. Otherwise, we're just having athletes sprint. And then the 1080 came in, and it more validated a lot of what we were doing. It wasn't necessarily changing the way I was coaching. It just allowed us to have great understanding of what was happening. And then I would just adapt my coaching, adapt resistances to make sure the athletes were really performing what I wanted. But the lasers still were my guide. Like in the end, I would have the combination of 1080 going and then timers going. 1080 pulling athletes for overspeed through timers. 1080 doing overspeed and then running through fly 10s. The timers were still the foundation of it. And that was the most important piece of it. And then later, I would say that the second thing was just having a jump mat of some quality that allowed me to do ground contact times. That was critical. Because I know at one point the jump mat didn't always have a ground contact feature. And that was something I realized was really important to me for the variety of types of plyometric stimuluses that we were trying to have, was just having one that does a vertical wasn't enough. I wanted it to be that you could come off of a box, land on it, and then jump onto a box. And I wanted to have that time. Or, any sort of plyometric combination you could create, that ground contact time was really important. How about for you, Nick?
Yeah. I think I would echo exactly what you're saying. Being able to have, because, we obviously have what we see, the feedback that we have to give, but having that timing system to be able to reaffirm to the athlete. So I had a girl who was in last night, softball player, great athlete, but terrible runner. She could cover 7 yards phenomenally, but outside of 7 yards, she was in trouble. And so, we're really trying to understand the concept of elevating your center of gravity, being able to create a longer stride with less ground contact time. And so for her, it was a very difficult experience. And she ran a 1-2-3 flying 10, um, but could not recreate it. And so as we would go through some adjustments to change the center of gravity, adjust that foot contact, that time would drop to, a 136, a 139, things like that. And I would explain to her, listen, your body is still getting used to this technique, this motion, how it's interacting with the ground. And by the time we got to the 7th, 8th, 9th rep, she's back down to a 1-2-5. Yeah. And so reaffirming to her, like, yes, it does feel very foreign right now, but you're going to be able to run exponentially faster than that 1-2-3 once we get confidence in this position. And so I think that is the biggest thing, to be able to reaffirm to them that, yes, the initial steps are going to be in the opposite direction that you want, but ultimately those steps are going to move us in the right direction. And then even using, VBT for similar ideas. We work with a lot of, luckily, a lot of guys who stay with us for a long time. I had a kid in here earlier today who is a shortstop for the Baltimore Orioles. I've worked with him since he was 13 years old. And so, being able to use things like VBT to talk to him about, like, listen, you deadlift 450. We don't need to chase 475. But what I do want to focus on is, the speed that we're moving in, how we're going through these reps, the movements that we're using, as opposed to just using the traditional pulls or the traditional lifts. And so, again, using that technology as the feedback to them of, okay, I'm not necessarily just chasing weight anymore. I'm focused on these other aspects of it. And again, going back to the timing system, I had a baseball guy in last night. And we've talked about our 10% drop rule in here before. And last night he ran 2 fly 10s, more than 10% from his max velocity, and we cut him off. And so it gave us the opportunity to talk about, like, listen, I can see that you look slow. I can see that you look heavy. You just came from baseball practice. And I know you, and I know that you're just going to try to grit through this. Like, it's not worth it. We're not getting anywhere. So again, I think that the technology is just that thing that helps us as veteran coaches to be able to show them, like, this is why we're doing what we're doing. This is, more of an explanation. Yeah. So with that said, I got a follow-up question for you. You and I have worked with a lot of young coaches. Yeah. We always have interns. We always have young coaches that we work with. Obviously, they are very excited to get in on the technology side. What is your recommendation, strategy to these coaches as far as the balance between implementing technology and developing a coach's eye? Do they develop a coach's eye, then use the tech? Do they use the tech to help develop the coach's eye? I mean, how do you recommend that to them?
Man, that is the $1 million question, isn't it? Like, the identity of a lot of these coaches is really reliant on the tech to guide a lot of their training protocols and the modifications you make. And through a discussion I was just having about who seems the most excited about leaning into tech, who is struggling the most with tech, we were saying, like, what age group is it that is kind of struggling the most navigating it? And the coach I was talking with was like, it's actually not the older coaches. The older coaches are excited about it. And I think, to what you're saying, like, they have a really strong coach's eye. They've coached a long time without tech. And so they have a really good idea of, man, if I had a little bit of tech here, I really think it would add value to what I'm doing. He said the ones that are really struggling are the young coaches coming out, because, one, everyone's looking at them assuming they have experience with everything. And they don't necessarily. Depending on where you go to school, who you intern with, you may not have touch points with everything. Number two is they don't actually know what's a good or bad product, because they're just specifically influenced by wherever they were at. That's what they were utilizing. They're not even aware of what else is out there. And then the third piece is they can't really understand the value of it, because that's what's shaped how they coach. And for me, I love that everyone can get exposed to as many different tech items as possible. And I would encourage, if you are a a young professional listening that you are going and trying to shadow with as many facilities as you possibly can, intentionally, with the idea of they have this piece of tech and I'd love to see how they utilize it. But challenge yourself. And I think about this all the time with challenge yourself to what can you do if you have no equipment as a coach?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe all you have is just your phone and you're just videoing a little bit and that's what's helping you coach without even having any video options. That was a great reflection for me this summer. As I was a private entity, I was working with a couple groups that I would just coach out in a field. And I didn't always want to bring out everything I possibly had as far as setting up timers, setting up jump mats, bands. I mean, it's not that much to set up, but there were times where I was like, you know what? No, we're not going to use any of that stuff. We're just going to have a good training session out here. What do I do when I don't have that as feedback? How do I coach that session? And it just challenges you to say, like, what really are your big rocks of coaching? What do I really look for posture, position, live in a rep versus slowing it down and looking at it on video? How do I know that an athlete is running fast versus 80% without having timers? Challenge myself to really understand what I'm seeing in front of me. And I think that's a great place for so many coaches to start. And that's, I mean, it's like with anything, right? If you're born into a lot of money, do you really appreciate the money you have? It's hard. And if you come into an atmosphere where you have all of the tech possible, it's hard to really appreciate that tech and understand the value it really can offer you. Whereas, man, if you come up with nothing, it's nice to have to be challenged to really understand what you would value as a coach. I'm sure as you nod that you have some similar thoughts on that. But even for you, like, I'd be curious because now your coaches are experiencing a really nice facility in BSP compared to out in a field with Nick bringing bands out. So they don't always get to experience that. Have you felt that same way with some of your younger coaches, that they kind of walk right into this atmosphere of this is the tech we use and it's just assume that this is how we coach?
Yeah, and we've been through several iterations, and I try to remind, my coaches of that. We've been through several iterations of facility. We've been through several iterations of technology. We were at one point where we had 4 or 5, I think 6 different pieces that we were using or said we were using on a weekly basis. And then we scaled back to where we just stopped using everything. And then we started scaling back up again. And so, I think that one thing that I have maybe learned over the years is similar to when you change staffs and you change roles and the positions that they're in, you change technology too, based on the individuals that you have around you. Because not everybody is going to be ready or want to handle some of the pieces or units that you have. For a young coach, I was talking to one of our coaches just yesterday in one of our one-on-one meetings, and she was like, I don't know how you can coach 4 athletes on 4 different programs and still see the entire facility at the same time and know who's supposed to be working with who and who's walking in the front door and what parent is asking a question. I'm like, well, because it takes time. It takes time to be able to know, like, I don't need to look at a program because I know what's next because I know what they've been doing for the last 4 weeks. I don't need to necessarily watch every single rep because I know that guy has that movement down. And so it's the difference between coaching at a 5,000 foot view and a 30,000 foot view. And I was talking to her about, how we bounce back and forth, and I'll get down in the weeds and we'll do a little bit of coaching and then I'll come back up to 30,000 feet and I'll look around. And I think it's the same thing with technology. You get so concerned about, like we were talking about the push bands. I would get so concerned about, do we have the right weight on? Did you hit the button to turn the band on? Did you get the first rep? Did you turn it off after the set? When you get to the point where you're like, okay, I'm not doing any coaching. I'm just trying to make sure the technology is running appropriately. And so I think the same thing happens when I'm working with different staffs. It's realizing, like, okay, what are we capable of using right now, as well as what's going to help us to coach them better. And ultimately, that's what has caused us to get rid of some units. Is it's like, okay, we weren't getting any better from that, and honestly, the quality of coaching went down.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the session was still great, but it wasn't because of the feedback that we were giving. It's just because there was a lot going on within the session.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I think that, similar to roles of the staff in the facility, I think the technology changes too based on the personalities that are within it.
I love that. And I know that you just mentioned the 1080 as far as something that is really valuable tool. Luckily, I was able to interact with it daily for several years. Are there any other pieces of tech or ideas that you've heard about that you're kind of excited to see more about, get your hands on, play with at some point here in this year that just kind of maybe have been sticking out to you recently?
I think the 1080 is number one for me. The 1080 or even a run rocket. I feel like I'm seeing a surge in run rockets again, and them starting to come back. And I think they've made a few iterations to their own tech and how it's used and the feedback that you get out of it. I'm interested to dive back into and spend a little bit more time with the force deck from Vault. And use them. We are luckily as a facility, we're getting to a point where we're training a lot more mature athletes because, like we talked about, our athletes stick around for a long time. This year we had 11 Division I commits for volleyball alone, and all of those girls have been training with us for 3 or 4 years. Well, their training has had to change, and so because that training is changing, we're needing some new and different technology in order to give us more feedback in some of the movements that they're going through. And I think that a force deck is going to be the next thing that we're going to need in order to kind of give them some of that feedback. So I think that is going to be kind of the next thing that we start working toward.
I love that. And obviously, like Nick's lens on this is going to be a part of curiosity, but also the business is going to drive where he's going. I get to be a little bit more free thinking with, I just see some things I think are pretty neat. One of the things that I've been talking with individuals about, it's not new, but just the scale that it's being utilized is some of the 3D motion capture for assessment piece. I think it's a really interesting piece of technology as far as being able to take an athlete through this with a little bit of video and photos, and now you're able to assess their squatting positions, how much valgus they have, the dorsiflexion they have, the hips, the angles they're creating out of that. Again, not to take anyone's job away, but to help create a story around how an athlete is moving and positioning, and being able to kind of just let the AI do that versus way back in the day, I don't even know if they still have to do this, but getting the goniometer out and checking ranges of motion and active and passive range. It's just it's always an interesting piece for me. One of the other things that I've never been able to dive fully into was I think it was breakaway data maybe, where if you had a video of an athlete running, you could then upload that. It would come back to you, and then it would give you a breakdown of all their angles and their projections, everything like that. Really, really cool. At the time that I was kind of talking with them and trying to demo it, it was too slow as far as that response time. That's part of it. Like if it's not live, it's really difficult to incorporate it into a training session. It's cool if you're like looking at videos later, or you have an athlete remotely training that it can give you breakdown. And then the third thing for me, which is not new at all, but I still have immense curiosity, is just the usage of GPS indoors. And not just indoors, but being able to have a system that allows for variable positioning indoors, which over the years I've talked to several companies and they're always working on that. But usually what happens is outside, you're using satellites to track everything. Inside, you can't get the data the same way. And so what happens is you have to kind of anchor up and make your own essential satellite inside your facility wherever you're using it. For me, as I talk to these companies, I've always said, if I'm moving around, whether I'm going into a high school and doing something, whether I'm going to a gym or I'm going out to a turf space, if I had ability to set up a few of these really simply, and it allowed me then to be able to track GPS wise, man, I would love to just get my hands on some of that data, curiosity wise, as far as like what really goes into our training sessions, some of those velocities, when are they occurring at? I think that part of it is really intriguing as far as just a pure speed piece, just the the technology hasn't quite been there yet. So those are
Right.
a couple pieces of things that are out there in the future. But I know one of the big questions that you were just talking about is essentially like, if I start using this tech, what is it really doing for my business?
Right.
And so, Nick, as we're kind of wrapping up this kind of topic of tech and how it's impacting our coaching and how it's impacting the athletes we're working with, how have you seen it impacting the business and what you're offering?
Yeah, and I think that that's something that you need to, if you are, a business, if you are a sports performance facility and you're thinking about bringing these on, what is a way that you can use that to potentially create a new revenue stream? Does it align so closely with what you do that you could do something like that? For example, I probably could not use a VBT system to help create more revenue. That's just not what we do. Obviously we do Olympic lifting, but I don't market to my parents how we create incredible Olympic lifters. That's not it. However, I could use something like Force Deck to create a higher value evaluation that I'm taking them through. And we've talked about even doing that here at BSP, is having 3 levels of evaluations where you have a free evaluation that's 10, 15 minutes, and it's, a couple of FMS movements, a jump, a sprint, and that's it. You could have another level of evaluation that's, say, $30, and you're taking them through a couple more tests that are a little more specific to what they need. And then you could have the ultimate level where they're doing, say, a $75 or $100 evaluation, and they're going through a full Force Deck screening. At the same time, something like a 1080, we are a gym that markets our speed. We market the ability to make athletes faster. And so obviously we've done it for 8 years without a 1080, and we've shown that we can get results with just about everybody that's come through these doors. But then to bring a piece of technology in like that, to then say, okay, well, this is something that all of our athletes will potentially have an opportunity to use at some point in their training, or you can sign up for this additional speed class each week, and you can know that you're going to use it once or twice a week, and we can give you data that you're taking home. We can show you the things that we're working on. And on top of your regular training that you're already doing, this additional class will be another $50, $70, $100 per session. And you can get into it 1 to 2 times a week, every week that you want to. And so then you're offsetting some of that cost. And ultimately, I think that that's something that we have to be looking at. When you're looking at picking up a unit that's $10,000 to $15,000, that's not something that you just want to eat and say, hey, it's helping me to be a better coach. Mm-hmm. No, you've got to find a way that you're paying that off. Yeah. And so, I think when you're looking at this data and technology, really thinking about, okay, how can we use this in order to improve what we're doing? Even for our coaches that are in the high school setting, there are many coaches that run like holiday camps and summer camps, and in order to create a little more revenue for themselves. And this is something else that you could be doing. You have a unit like this that's at your school, and offering sessions at the end of the day after team training is done, or offering it on the weekends or over breaks, and being able to bring in, you could have a group of 20 that you're training over the holidays in one 1080 unit. And you can still, because the whole session is not on the 1080, it's just a device that you're using within it. Just like you talked about, doing a little bit of overspeed on the 1080, then getting off of it and getting into some fly 10s afterwards. That's something that you could be doing. And so again, I think that when we think about committing the fiscal aspect of this, whether it's a one-time purchase or a monthly subscription, figuring out like how do we build in some additional revenue streams.
Yeah. And you're spot on to share not a theoretical, but an actual story. It was at TC Boost when we brought in the 1080. That was when we said, all right, we're going to start charging for every assessment that we do. And everybody gets a force velocity profile on there, and it only takes 4 sprints on it, but that allows us then to incorporate it into our training regularly. And at first, we weren't comfortable just jumping into that. And so when we made that purchase, it was a very exclusive, like Nick was just talking about, to say, all right, well, if you want to do a 1080 assessment, it's going to cost this much to do a 1080. Well, eventually we got way better at using it. We understood what the minimums were in order to get a quality evaluation out of it. And so it became something that we could use much easier at scale, and that made it where it's like, okay, well, now every evaluation we're doing is now going to have a price to it. And that's going to help us really quickly pay off essentially what the cost was, as it's a reinvestment into the business side for sure. And
Right.
that's exactly why we didn't go with Nord boards. And like they had us demo that, and we were testing it like crazy. And then we were like, all right, well, we've tested all of our athletes, and what have we found? And essentially it was that they should do Nordic curls. And like, okay,
Yeah.
well, I don't know if that's a reason to invest $6,000. It's just so it tells us that everyone needs to do Nordic curls. Like, it wasn't for our space. It just didn't make sense as an assessment tool. It wasn't really guiding us to better coaching, better training modifications. And so it didn't make sense. Like Nick said, the VBT worked the same way. Like, VBT was the opposite, directly impacted our style of coaching. And Nick mentioned it wasn't a big selling point for them. It actually was for us. As we said, like, we are a speed facility. And they said, well, what do you do in the weight room? We said, nothing really traditional. It's all about how fast you measure. Like, that's what we do here. We do some of the similar movements you've done in the past, but everything we do is measured for velocity purposes. We're not trying to max out weights. And you know who likes the sound of that? Female athlete parents, track athletes love the sound of that. Basketball players love the sound of that. Like, all of those ones, I'm sure volleyball players would love to hear that versus we got to get them stronger and we're going to be lifting them with a bar all the time. Like, yeah, we did, but it was under that guideline. And man, families loved the sound of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and again, it also comes down to the marketability of these things and how sexy they are. Kids love the idea of being attached to a piece of equipment and getting a ton of data out of it. You put them on a Nord board and you say, hey, you're going to go through a forward lean. And they're like, really? This is it? This is what I'm going to do? And same thing with a VBT. You're going to grip this thing and rip it as hard as you can. And I'm going to get to see on a computer screen, like, the information that's coming out of it. Like, it's easier to market those things as opposed to some of the other items that they may give us great information, but for an athlete, it doesn't get them going the same way.
And I think the challenge that always is going to exist is when you are either the head of your department, you're the owner of your business, is keeping sure that the identity of your facility, your training methodology, your style of coaching is something beyond the technology. Because the technology changes, everyone else will get it eventually. In our facility in Northern Chicago, we were one of the only ones that had laser timers for the longest time. Then everybody had those. Then we were one of the only ones that was utilizing a jump mat. Then everybody had a jump mat. Then we were the only one with a 1080 for years. And now I've seen, I think, 4 locations have a 1080 variation. So if your identity is tied to tech, you're setting yourself up that at some point you're going to get surpassed, or somebody's just going to match you. And if they deliver a better product and experience, they're going to beat you. They're going to win. And like Nick said earlier, as a young coach, understanding how to become a really good coach without tech and understanding the gaps that the tech can then fill for you is crucial in understanding what that identity is.
Well, and understanding too that the newness is going to wear off. It's the same thing as these facilities that open up. They have brand new, immaculate weight rooms, shiny weights, the best racks and benches. You can have all the best technology, but sooner or later it gets uncovered. And people realize, like, okay, it was fun to use that the first 5 times, but I don't know that I'm getting any more out of it, and you can't continue to buy new and continue to bring in more tech in order to cover up a lack of ability to coach or a lack of ability to run a business or lack of ability to create a culture. And so you've got to understand that you have to have those things down set before you worry about the flashiness of everything that you're doing.
Some NCAA football teams might argue with you on that.
That's fine.
The number of SEC schools getting new weight rooms every 2 years because theirs is just
Right.
too old, and you can't recruit players if you have that old equipment there. I mean, it's funny to me because exactly as you're saying, like, what are you talking about? Like, we recruit new clients every single day that are paying us with
Right.
the same equipment we've had for years because it's a different type of invitation that we're offering them. We're
Yeah.
not putting it like that's always the sign of, I think, just a terrible tour of a gym as well. And as somebody walks through your doors to go start walking around, just point to all the things in
Yeah.
there. No wonder people don't want to train there or they want to go to a different facility. Like, you're just pointing to equipment. It's
Right.
like the health club model. Like, there's our chest machines, our treadmills are there. Like, that's not really entice me to be there. You got to be
Right.
more than that, which is always a challenge.
Yeah.
So I think what I would love to have an interaction, and we're going to make some posts about this, is just kind of asking people some of the tech that they've utilized, what their tech that they're excited about going forward, and see if we can have some conversations with those people. We can bring them into this place, ask some questions around what is this really offering, who's utilizing it, what type of coaches is it making the most impact with, to kind of help with that process of navigating all of these different techs that some are competing, and it's hard to tell which one is the right one to invest in.